Welcome, Faithful Politics listeners and watchers. If you're viewing us on YouTube or wherever you are, enjoying us from your podcast platform, this is your faithful host, Josh Bertram. And of course, we have with us Will Wright. Will Wright, how is everything going? How's your campaign for president?
Oh, it's going
in
well.
Mexico. It's good.
I just announced on CompuServe
Nice.
recently, and it went really well. So
good.
Had like 3 people.
Hey, 3's better than none. All right, that'll work. And today we have with us Rachel I. Wightman. She is a librarian, an educator, and a believer in integrating faith and fact-checking. And we are big believers in that too, so this is great. She is the Associate Director for Instruction and Outreach at Concordia University, St. Paul, prior to moving to Minnesota. In 2012, she served as a librarian and missionary in Kampala, Uganda, and I might have butchered that name, but thank you so much. And she's the author of the new book, Faith and Fake News. I'm going to show it here. Faith and Fake News, which we're super excited to kind of dig into that and other topics. So, Rachel, thanks so much for being on the podcast with us this morning.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely, man. We're super, super excited. So I just got to ask first, what got you, what got you into writing this book? How did they do it? I mean, I've never actually read a book written by a librarian, so it's very interesting to start looking into this. So how did you get interested in this topic? Because when I was at school and I was looking at my librarian, it's like you're super librarian or something. And you anyway, go ahead.
Oh, that's funny. Well, I guess I should caveat, as a librarian, I'm not in it for the books. I'm actually in it for the information. So I became
Don't tell anybody.
I know, right? Keep it under wraps. I like to start a lot of my classes with I'm not going to shush you. We're not going to talk about the Dewey Decimal System. We're talking about information, and that's really, I actually came to it through more of a community development side of things. So, I was taking graduate classes in community development, and one of my professors said the best, and I was working in a library, but I was taking these classes, and one of my professors said the best community developers are librarians because they connect people to people and people to information. And that kind of was the light bulb moment for me. And so then I switched gears and I did my master's degree in library and information science. And I really come to all of these things, my work at the university, my book, my workshops I do at churches, as how can I help teach people to find and use information well, ethically, wisely. And so that's kind of how I came to the profession, was really through a teaching and information point of view. And I've been a librarian for over 15 years now, and I've mostly worked with college students. And so we spend a lot of time with college students, probably what you're remembering, you have to write a paper and you need some sources and the librarian helps you. But about 3 or 4 years ago, it's probably, about 4 years ago in 2019, we were all looking ahead to 2020 as an election year. And as a librarian, I'm always kind of looking at how people my lens is how people look at information, even in my personal life. So in these conversations I was having with friends and family, I was starting to notice this theme of people talking about news and where they got their news and how they got their news and how their friends got their news and the disagreements that were kind of coming together for those folks. And so I was noticing this theme. And then at my church, I was taking a class on intercultural competence. And we were talking, about some of our internal biases. And I was thinking a lot about how our online spaces are so personalized. And so I started to wonder about the role our information and online spaces have in our biases in terms of what we see and then how it impacts the way we respond to people. So it was all of these little moments. I guess that's sort of life, right? You notice these little pieces and then they kind of all come together. And then also at my church, the pastor was giving a sermon one Sunday about, they were doing a series on systemic racism. And one of the pastors said this comment that it really stuck with me. He said, it's really important for us to check our inputs and get information. What he was saying was like, get information from people who might be different than us. And I remember thinking like, well, I don't know how well people can do that. It's really hard to find, like your
Right.
online space is so
Right.
personalized. How are you going to find something that's like a different point of view?
That's a great point.
And so I kind of just like had all these moments that kind of came together. And then I asked our church leadership about offering a class on misinformation. And it just kind of grew from there. A couple of news outlets heard about it and they were like, a church is doing a workshop on misinformation? Like it like didn't make sense. And so a couple of news outlets wrote stories about what I was doing and then with my church, and then there was like word of mouth. Other churches heard about it. And so then they wanted me to offer my classes. And then from there, I had the opportunity to write this book, which I hope gets that information to more people than I can just do in the workshops that I do.
Right.
And really for me, it really came down to this idea of how do we equip the church, the big C church? How do we equip people to think critically about the information they're finding and then use that wisely in how they engage with other people. And so it's
so
been
good.
it's been a journey. I started that first class right as COVID, that was like a 5-week series and it ended like literally the week before COVID was started. And then my church.
So those people were prepared for COVID.
Yeah, exactly. And then ever since then, most of the workshops I've done have been on Zoom because it was the pandemic. And so then
I gotta ask. Oh yeah, sorry. I gotta ask. Will's got a question, but I gotta ask. Like, did you ever have like someone post something that was in one of your classes, and you're like, oh no, they totally missed everything that I told them, and you were so disappointed?
I haven't.
And what are their names? Okay, never mind. Okay. Oh, good.
I mean, thankfully, but I also don't like necessarily. I'm not always friends with everybody on social media, so they could still be. I have had people take my class and still say things that I thought, oh, I think we're missing each other because you just said, like one time I was doing a workshop and someone said like, oh, I guess we're supposed to believe in science now. And I was like, I think we've always like what? And so I remember like, okay, how do I talk through this? Like in a way that's like kind, but also like, yes, science is still important.
Wow, that's so great. There's something that you said that wasn't actually part of my normal, wasn't part of my original question, but you mentioned something about how your pastor was given a message about systemic racism, and I thought that was so cool.
I noticed that too.
I mean, as a pastor, or not, I'm not a pastor. Josh is a pastor. I'm throwing that little nugget out there as
The
ideas.
systemic racism. Hey, we did one on politics, and we talked about all sorts of. But you're right, we should do one on race and racism.
But my question is, so your book is called Faith and Fake News. I think most people know, or at least have a sense or understanding of what faith is. But we use fake news sort of very loosely in this country, and I was wondering if you can just define what is fake news.
Yeah, it's a good question. And that's something that I think is really important to talk through because it can be totally it's very loaded. I actually really prefer the terms misinformation and disinformation, where misinformation is just things that are not true, maybe from lack of context, maybe blatantly incorrect. And then disinformation is the misinformation, but with the intent of it being very incorrect. So usually misinformation is more like I said, the context is incorrect, or there's something missing, or someone didn't realize it was wrong. But then disinformation is like actually the intent of creating incorrect information. And fake news sort of lives kind of overarching all of it in terms of but it's become a very loaded term. It certainly works well for a book title, but I don't know that it's a term I use in like my workshops, and I don't actually use the term very often in the book because I think it is so loaded it can actually turn people off, because there's a lot of like finger pointing around what people think is fake news. They're going to say, sometimes people think it's fake just because they disagree with it. And so but certainly fake news has been used for a long time, really, around just things that are incorrect. And I think in the last 5-ish probably years, it's gotten incredibly loaded.
Yeah, absolutely. And the term is so loaded, it's crazy. I want to even take it a little bit even back, even a little bit further, and drill down into. And this might sound. I have no idea how this question is going to go. It's not like a really hard question, but it might be like an ambiguous one. What is information? Like we throw that term around, but when you're like, what? Like there are different types of information, I'm assuming, and what is information? What's the particular kind of information that we're looking at when we're thinking about, like, if we're consuming information, what exactly are we consuming?
Yeah,
And the metaphor implies that we're like, taking it in and
Yep.
whatever comes in. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, this is such a good question, and I think it's another one that I often try to start with. I start with that in my book, and I start with that in my workshops. Like information, like I talk about the information landscape, really. And if you think about like historically, people got information, it was like through maybe word of mouth or print media after the printing press was invented. But really, we live in this world where we have so many things coming at us. So information is like this big umbrella term, talking about social media, which includes images, it includes videos, it includes text, it includes news. It's certainly, there are lots of forms of information, like you said, right? Like the different forms of media. So videos, certainly, radio. So a lot of, and I think in the last few years with social media, we're just seeing a lot more visual information, visual media, certainly through social media. And I think that's been a big change. So yeah, there's so much information coming at us, and it covers so many topics too, right? It's entertainment, it's news, it's just texting with people, it's communicating. And so we just have information coming towards us in so many ways, in so many platforms, so many types. And that's sort of what I'm getting at in my book, is just like, it can be really overwhelming for people. And so then how can we be more wise about engaging with that?
Yeah, like, is there a type of information? And I know Will's got a question, but is there a type of information that like is more like prone to being misinterpreted? Like obviously when they use like statistical information is a kind of information that I feel like can be very easy to manipulate and show you like, hey, look at this thing on a graph that shows you, but it keeps out certain information, right?
Mm-hmm.
So is there a certain type that's worse or better?
I don't think so. I think misinformation can happen anywhere. I think and I think that, human beings create information. Well, now we're getting into a lot of conversations about AI, which I'll set aside for now. But, like historically, information was created by people, and people have biases, and people have their own agendas. And so I think I don't think there's one thing that's more or less likely to be misinterpreted or to have misinformation. One thing, when I was writing my book, I was doing a little bit of research, and I found a lot of information around how misinformation, I thought this was so interesting. Misinformation isn't new. I mean, there's always been conspiracy theories and misinformation, but a lot of times that there was an increase when there was a change in technology. So when the printing press was invented and suddenly there was like a proliferation of printed content, there was also an increase in misinformation. And then, when you look at when the radio came about, again, kind of this like burst of misinformation, even though it had always been happening, but like as technology has changed, then there are just new ways for that to happen. And I think that's certainly what we're seeing on social media. And so I think it's just whatever the platform is, kind of can be part of spreading misinformation, unfortunately.
Yeah, I'm curious. So as the author, I'd love for you to talk to us about your own personal discipline in consuming news. I know that you have a lot of really great exercises in the book, and I'd like to ask you a little bit more about that in a little bit. But what are your habits, and how do you receive information?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. No one's ever asked me that before. I'll say that I'm just as human as anybody else. And so it is hard, to do even some of the exercises that I put in the book can be even hard for me. But I think a couple things that I try to do, and I talk about this in the book as well, is like because our online spaces are so personalized, it can be really easy to just start seeing the same kinds of, we're like in an echo chamber essentially. And so honestly, one of the biggest things I do is to try really hard to get out of that whenever I can, even though it's really hard and I don't always want to. Purposely saying, okay, I have mostly been listening, to public radio news on my way to work every day. So maybe I should like look at a different website for my news one day this week, or just to get a different view of things, and not just be looking at the same or hearing the same news over and over again. I think that's one of the biggest things that I do. And when I like follow people on social media, I try to follow people with a variety of viewpoints. I think what we're seeing is like more and more people getting news from social media. And so and I'm part of that too. Like that's where sometimes I'll see something. I'm like, oh, I didn't know that happened. And so trying really hard to think about like balancing, who I'm following on social media or where I'm getting my news from. I think that's one of the biggest things that I have tried to do. I talk in the book about like the algorithms, right? Like they kind of take what we've done in the past to then give us what we're going to see next, right? To predict what we want to see. And so sometimes I like to joke that I'm like going to try to mess with my algorithm. So like if I start to notice I'm seeing a lot of the same things, then I'm like, okay, how can I try to find something different? And sometimes it's really innocuous, right? Like, like I have a 14-year-old, a son that's 14 months old. And so I see a lot of like parent content or, a lot of like kid related content just because I've been searching for those things. And so sometimes it's not that, it doesn't really, it might not really matter. But then when it comes to like current events and politics and things like that, that's where I'm trying to find a variety of viewpoints. And that's one habit that I've tried to maintain. I think back during the pandemic, like at the beginning of the pandemic, I was kind of just always getting my news from like one source, which wasn't bad, but I remember starting to feel really anxious. Like I was living out of a place of fear for a while. And eventually I had to like kind of wrestle with that was actually related to my information consumption. Like I was consuming things that were making me really anxious. And so I had to kind of make a choice. Did that mean I needed to like take a step back? Did it mean I needed to look at some other news sources? Like there were a variety of steps I could take, and I had to kind of think through what are they going to be. And so those are some of the things. So that's that noticing. I guess the last thing I'll say is noticing my internal state, which I talk about in the book as well. Like it's not something we like do very naturally, is to like be like, oh, I'm feeling anxious. We just sit on our phones and we can doom scroll for a really long time. And so trying to learn how to pay attention to that and like, what am I feeling? What am I noticing? And then what should I do about that?
Doom scroll. I love that. I'm going to start using that. That'll preach, Will.
There's a Twitter account called like Doom Scroll Interrupter or something like that. That basically like says, why don't you take a break right now and enjoy the air, or something.
Nice.
So like,
it's like your watch. Hey, I'm noticing you've
been sitting too
that
long.
You're kind of stressed. Get up and go take a walk. Stop looking at the news that I'm providing you.
I know. Well, it's interesting, and the reason I asked the question is because personally, I'm actually interested in how people consume news because, everybody probably thinks that the way they're consuming news is the right way, and I'm no exception. I mean, like I think people really get surprised when I tell them that I get a lot of my news from Twitter, and they're like, wait, what? And it's like, I don't necessarily follow news organizations per se, Fox, CNN, what have you. I follow reporters. So I'll subscribe or I'll follow reporters that I trust. And, if I want news about the White House, I'm going to follow like White House correspondents that are with the president, that are saying what's happening in real time in 280 characters. And it's like, I can get a good sense of what's going on without all the fluff, fairly quickly. And I also read, source documents, because I'm a big advocate of, don't watch cable news if you have an interest in one particular area, because cable news just sort of, they tell you what's important. Whereas you may have interest in other things, like, there's a lot of different things. I'm interested in national security, immigration, LGBTQ issues, stuff like that. So I follow reporters that cover that stuff. Like the news cycle on CNN, Fox, what have you, probably won't go into depth with those things. And then I'll follow up by actually reading source documents. So, here's sort of like a plug for our Facebook page, anyways, like our Faithful Politics Facebook page, is I'm always constantly posting source documents, Senate intel reports, legal documents, that reporters are posting. I guess to that end, with regards to, truthiness, as Stephen Colbert used to say on a show, like how do we know that stuff is actually not fake? Or, how can we check, the validity of the information that we're actually consuming?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think those are really important points too, and I think whenever we can go back to the original source is so helpful, because it's getting us to what's actually happening, and I think that's really, really important. And I think your point about following reporters who are there, right, that like on the ground point of view is so helpful when we're consuming news and trying to learn about current events, right? But it is getting harder to tell if something is true, because people can create accounts, they can doctor images, all of these things. And so I think following people you trust, which is what you said, I think is certainly a big part of that. Following news organizations that have high reporting journalistic standards is also really important, because they will often, if they have those ethical standards, they will hopefully also report when they get something wrong, right? They'll make a correction. But in terms of just like everyday scrolling, I think that's exactly where people are struggling. And even I sometimes have to like pause. Like, I forget what I saw, something just the other day, something about Target, some controversy that was happening with Target. And the images I saw, I was like, wait a second, and I think there's a little bit of just like, we don't always know if something is true, but we have to be paying attention enough to notice what could cause us to be like, what? I don't know if that makes sense. It's almost like we won't know if something's true, but we have to be self-aware enough to pause, and then we can check. And there are people who do fact checking all the time. So there's lots of ways to check things, but I almost feel like we're in an environment, we're swimming in this information landscape that's really overwhelming. And if we're just getting sucked into it, we're never going to check. But if we can like notice those little like, wait a second, it would have been easy for me to be like, what? That's crazy. Keep going. But it was like enough for me to be like, what? And I'm going to go Google that really quick and just see if I can get a little more information. And I like answered my question in 30 seconds and moved on. So it's not like I was like deeply researching something. I don't know if that really answers your question about how do we know if something is true. I think it's really hard, and I think we have to pay attention to ourselves, and we have to get out of this mindlessness, I think, that kind of pervades our online spaces, and be a little bit more mindful to pause. And then we can check, right? We can check who created it. We can check you can reverse search an image to see if it's not if it's been doctored, right? You can, there's a lot of things like tools you can use. But I think it starts with just even that like pause and that noticing, that mindfulness of like, oh, wait a second, what? And then we can use those tools to say like, is there someone who's already checked this? Who is this creator? Are they a reporter that's with the president? So then I can trust that they were there. Like we can do that. Yeah, we can do that.
Person. Yeah, totally. The fact checking thing is so interesting to me because everyone is all this proliferation of fact checking websites, right? So you can go to the fact check website and then it's like, boom, Trump card, boom, here's a fact check website. You're wrong. Here's my bias fact check website from www.democratbias.com, democratfactcheckbias.com, and then there's the Republican one that I run. And so we can, but the point being, right, that we all go to these different sources because you got one source and you got to fact check that, but then how do you fact check the fact checkers?
And hopefully the good fact checking websites have documented their sources. To Will's point about the original sources. Hopefully they cited where they got it.
At what point do you say, you're like, oh, sometimes I go 30 seconds and that's wrong, or that's not wrong, but I'm done. So that's wrong. Like whatever I saw, I can figure out that it was wrong. Now I'm moving on. It only took me 30 seconds to figure that out, and sometimes totally. What do you do when it doesn't take 30 seconds? Like, what do you do when it's a bit more convincing? Or what do you do when it's like, this fact check is saying this is wrong, right? And there's the myth you kind of talk about of doing your own research. How can we do our own research really and make sure that, how can we fact check the fact checkers, I guess? And then when is it like for you, like, I got to go really deep into this because I can't just take 30 seconds. It's going to take longer. What kind of issues do you feel like require that kind of effort?
I feel like
that was a nice, easy softball for you.
Yeah, exactly. I feel like no one really likes my answer on this because I think it depends. And I don't mean that as a cop-out, but I really think it does. One of the things, like when I'm working with college students, a lot of times we're talking about like research as a process. And I think that we live in a culture that we want quick answers, right? We want to be able to check something very quickly and move on. And I think it depends. I think in my example earlier, like it was an easy thing. I just kind of was like, oh, okay, that's the answer. But sometimes it's not. And so I do think that there are things that we do need to spend more time on. There are issues that are really important to us. There are current events that are really complex. And so we do need to spend more time and like dig deeper. I don't know that there's always going to be clear guidelines around when we should do which. And that's where I am trying to encourage people to really pay attention. In the Christian world, we talk a lot about listening to the Holy Spirit or listening for promptings or paying attention to our spirit or the Spirit. And so I think there is a piece of like, where are we feeling those tugs to pay more attention and then dig deeper there? I think in the book, I'm talking about like knowing our limits and then saying like, we can research things, but sometimes we don't have the expertise to research them all the way. And so that's where I think your point, Will, about, again, following the experts or going to the source documents is helpful. And like during the pandemic, right? Like listening to experts in infectious disease is important. And because I can do all the research I want, but at the end of the day, that's not my field of expertise. And so I think it depends. Sometimes we can just be like, we got it. They did a fact check. I saw their sources. I'm good. And then sometimes it's like, we need to dig a lot deeper. Sometimes we can find an expert who's already done that digging for us. And so I'm going to skirt your question a little bit and just say it kind of depends.
I mean, yeah, I totally understand. Go ahead.
Well, in politics, it's always answer the question that you want to answer. don't answer the question that's asked. So I think
Perfect.
you did a great job. So awesome.
Yeah, you got a great career as a politician.
Yeah. So I guess why is it important that believers, and specifically maybe Christian believers, have healthy news consumption habits and some degree of media literacy? Like, why is that important to the faith?
Yeah, I spent a lot of time thinking about that as I've developed sort of this curriculum and obviously as I was writing this book, and it just felt like I think there were a couple reasons. One, it seems like people of faith and in some of the Christian circles I was talking to, like, it was like a big disconnect from what was happening in the world. Like, if we're not consuming information well, or news well, or media literacy, we don't have media literacy, we don't know what's happening in the world around us, which seems really important. To be in, right, like that verse of being in the world but not of it, but like we're in this world, we need to know how to navigate it well. And as people who want to share certain truths of our faith, I feel like someone just asked me the other day about our witness, and like, if we're not able to like speak about current events, or speak intelligently or think critically, I worry that we're going to hurt any kind of witness about any other kind of truth that we might want to share. And so to me, it felt really important to like give people tools to live in our current world, and to be able to engage with that well, so that when they are having conversations with people, they're well informed. I mean, I know how I feel when I haven't been paying attention. I mean, we can't pay attention to everything all the time, but when I'm kind of like disconnected from the news, I feel sort of like, wait, what's happening? How do I talk about this? And so I think there's like a piece of just being aware and knowing what's
Will
happening.
never feels that way, by the way.
I'm guessing not.
Will never has that feeling, like all the rest of us mortals.
Yeah. Well, just some inside baseball. Josh just realized right before we started recording that Trump had announced his presidency. He's like, oh, when did he do that? I'm like, dude, like a couple months ago.
Yes, indeed. I was thinking while you were talking, like, because we talked a little bit about the idea of doing your own research, and one of the things I was wanting you to do is to dig into that a little bit more, and specifically, like, my question kind of revolves around the Dunning-Kruger effect. And so I've heard this talked about a bunch by one of my good buddies, and basically having to do with bias, and that you can learn a little bit. It's like enough to be dangerous, that kind of idea. That's like the Dunning-Kruger is what's behind that kind of idea. So it's like, how can we embrace humility? How do we do it? What are the signs that we can look for, and some checks and balances that we can have, so that we don't fall victim to this Dunning-Kruger effect, that we do an hour of research and we're like, dude, I know that this person's wrong, dude. I watched that documentary. I did an hour of research. Mm-hmm. So even dig more, honestly.
Yeah.
Help us dig more into what real research looks like.
Yeah.
And means, and what would someone have to do to actually be able to say, Rachel, I've done my own research, and then you're like, yeah, you're right, you have.
Mm-hmm. I think the humility piece is really important, that you touched on, around how do we know when we don't know something. I think when we do have access to so much constant information, it can often feel like, oh, well, I already know. I read that one news article, so I'm good.
We can feel omnipotent, right?
Yeah, I have all the information.
We can figure anything out. Yeah.
I have my smartphone.
Omniscient is what I meant. Yeah.
I have my phone. It's a computer. I can look up anything. I listened to a TED Talk once where the speaker used the term Google know. So we can Google know a lot of things.
And AI is only going to make this worse. Yes. Way worse.
We can Google know, we can AI know, we can do that very easily. And so I think, to your point, that humility of saying, but I don't know, I can't do that for anyone, and that's the hard part, right? Like I can't say like, well, you didn't do it, like we can only do that for ourselves. We only know for our internal selves, like, did I do enough research? And yeah, I don't even know how to answer your question exactly. I think
I understand. I don't either.
it's like I don't know what would constitute enough research. I think the other thing I talk a lot with college students, and I think this is probably, it's more of a like academic way of talking about information, but it's certainly relevant here too, is this idea of a scholarly conversation. And I think that's the world we live in, is like this constant conversation. And in academics, we talk about the scholarly conversation, meaning like a researcher does something and then the next person builds on it. So then they're like kind of responding to the first person and then so on. Like we saw that during the pandemic all the time, right? They were continually doing more research. So it was continually advancing a scholarly conversation. And what does that look like for the rest of us who are not scholars in a lot of things, maybe only certain things? And so we're part of these conversations on Twitter, on social media, and it is this like ever evolving conversation. And so it can be really hard to feel like we can do enough research, because by the time we start doing research on something, it might have changed. And then there's more things, especially with certain current issues or current events. And so I don't know how we know when it's enough. But I do think there's some value in us saying maybe we don't always know. And I think we live in a world, and sometimes I do feel like sometimes the Christian faith can be very much like, we have all the answers, we know the truth. And I don't feel like that is, in my experience, that's going to turn people away instead of opening a conversation with them. And so I think it's the same thing with our research, right? If we can say, I've done this research, and maybe you do feel like an expert on it, but being willing to say, and there may be something I missed, right? Even just like acknowledging we didn't get it all right, I feel like is like a tiny piece of keeping that door open to saying like, I have done a lot, but maybe I don't know everything.
Right. Cause there's certain times when like there's certain things that we can do mentally that can almost safeguard us even when we know nothing about something. Mm-hmm. Right? I mean, we could maybe ask something like, hey, could you show me how you came to that conclusion?
Right.
And if it doesn't make sense to you, then maybe it's an ignorance issue. Mm-hmm. Right? So you need to know more. But then at least if there's someone who can't explain something to you, like, or hey, here's a classic one that I hear. You're not ready for that yet? Mm. I've heard that, or I don't hear that too often, but I have heard that. You're not ready for that.
Yeah.
Or it's too complicated. Like, I don't have time to explain this all to you. Mm-hmm. Those like are very clear, like signs, like this person probably doesn't know what they're talking about. Mm-hmm. You know what I'm saying? Especially if you hear that online, because like, wait, what do you mean you don't have time? Like, you can just come back to it later. Mm-hmm. Like, you know what I mean? It doesn't, you mean basically, I don't know what I'm talking about. I don't know. Do you have any? Well, I know Will's got a question, but I just thought like we have to figure out how to just be a critical thinker. Mm-hmm. I feel like if people were just using, like, just even taking a second to pay attention and just use the basic thought processes that I believe God has blessed everyone with. Basic, as long as all the faculties are working, you know, and the way that they're supposed to work, whatever that means, but they're functioning, right? Then you can use reason, mm-hmm. right? Naturally, it's there. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that before Will. I know Will's got a question, but it's mind blowing to me sometimes the way that we accept things.
Yeah. I mean, I hope people like that's what I hope with this book, is just to give people some tools to think about things a little bit more carefully, instead of just taking everything completely at face value, which is easy to do when you're online.
Yeah, you have a chapter in your book that discusses, seeking out new perspectives, and I want to kind of get a sense, of why that's important, and before you answer, I thought that chapter was probably the most applicable, at least to what Josh and I are trying to do. I mean, Josh is the token conservative pastor. I'm sort of the token liberal progressive. Our show has had a broad range of guests, going from pretty far left to pretty far right.
I would say so, yes. We interviewed the first trans bishop and Episcopal transgender bishop, so it's pretty. Yeah, that's pretty left as far as Christian shows go. I think evangelical or whatever. Yeah, we're not evangelical. Guess what are we? Who knows? I
have no idea. and we talked to the guy who started the Reawaken tour with Michael Flynn. So it's like those are the bookmarks, if you will. And I just think it's really important to just talk to people that think differently than you. But I'd love to get your thoughts about why is it important to seek out new perspectives.
Yeah, one of the things I've noticed as I've been doing this work the last few years is, people, the idea of like, fact checking, is great, right? But there's like the deeper relational pieces that I think are actually the most important. And to me, it felt like, we're living in these spaces online that are highly personalized, so we're not seeing different perspectives. And then second of all, it felt like if we're going to talk about with people, because at the end of the day, I think a lot of questions people have around misinformation is actually, how do I talk to people about information? It may not be so much like, how do I know if something is true, but like the application piece is where I think a lot of people have questions. How do I talk to my friend who I think believes misinformation, but maybe it's just a different point of view? So I feel like it ends up being very relational. And as I was exploring all of that, it just felt like so important for us to say, how do we talk to people who might have different, like exactly what you're doing on this podcast? How do I talk to people who have different views or whatever politics than I do? And how do I purposely seek that out? We don't live in a world that makes that easy. We can go about our lives. We can stay in our literal physical bubbles and our online echo chambers. And it just felt like, to me, like, God made this beautiful world with people with lots of perspectives, and there's a lot of things that are never, Josh is the pastor, but don't seem to be explicitly stated in Scripture about what to do about them. And so listening to some different perspectives felt so important to me to get a better understanding of what is happening in our world and how we can address it. And if we just stay in our little lane, it just seems like we would miss so much information and a perspective from other people, and care for them and care for how God made this world.
That makes so much sense. Oh, sorry about that. I was muted. I apologize. I thought I was hitting the space bar and then I was hitting a different button. That is so lame. That is so lame. So I love this whole conversation because critical thinking to me is so important. And I feel like there's just some simple things that you can do, like ask questions. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Like you said something like, how can we listen to people with different perspectives? Well, I know we can ask questions. Mm-hmm. Questions get both of our minds going. I think you can run into an issue if people think that you're asking leading questions, mm-hmm. Or you're trying to, trick them or paint them into a corner or something like that. But we got to be able to ask questions and ask questions about things that don't make sense to us. And I think not being afraid to ask questions when we get that, I love that what you said, tug in the heart, like, that just seems like that doesn't really line up, or even that lines up too much. Like, I agree with this way too much. There must be something wrong with it because I agree with everything it's saying. You know what I'm saying? Like, at that point, like everything, if everything I'm reading I agree with, then there's a problem, right? I guess that's kind of like one of the themes here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I just felt how do we help people? I guess I'll just say, like, I don't know. How do we help people see there's so many other, I don't know. I feel like that's where growth happens, is when we can listen
Yes.
and talk to people and see things online that are different than what we expect. And that's where like we grow the
Totally.
most.
We grow, and you've hit on this a few times kind of peripherally as we've been talking, but this idea of how important truth is, right? And bringing the Christian perspective on truth, right, should be that we're seeking absolute truth. And so we're not afraid of any piece of evidence. We're not afraid of anything that might lead us to a more profound understanding of truth, right? So what are the kinds of things like that? What are the kind of risks that you see for the church, the consequences of not taking this more seriously in America, for the church, specifically Christians, because we're the majority religion, because we're a majority culture, even though people would argue that, I get that, but it's still majority. When Eastern countries think about America, they many times think of Christian West, right? America's Christian. So what are the risks that you see inherent within this? Why is this so important that we get this right now?
Yeah, I think we risk just continuing to live in our own little silos. I remember when I lived in Uganda having a conversation. So this was 10 years ago, but having a conversation with some of the students I worked with about churches in America and how there's that like sort of joke, but it's not really a joke, that Sunday mornings are like the most segregated hours in the week. And I'm sure there's a lot to unpack there, but I remember trying to explain to them how even as a church, we were all, and it wasn't even necessarily like about racial segregation, but just that we all like go to our little, this is my denomination, and this is like, I have these things or people in my life that are all kind of the same. And we can, as the church, just be in our own little lane, whether that's denominational or whatever, and we're just missing out. And I actually wonder if then we're going to miss out on more truth if we're just staying in our own path, our own whatever it is, the denomination or whatever, our views on something. Are we going to miss out on, like for the church, are we going to miss out on a deeper understanding of truth? Are we going to miss out on a deeper understanding of who God is? Because we're all just staying in our little lanes and we're not thinking critically about either social issues, current issues, news, whatever, theology, right? We're just staying in these lanes. And I worry that we're going to miss out on a deeper understanding of the world, of God, of our faith, because we're not paying attention to what's going on around us.
That makes so much sense. That I even see larger, like even more looming, scary things that if Christianity, if we don't start thinking about things well, we could risk a lot of even like the inherent like social fabric, I feel like, of what makes this country so great, its ability to be pluralistic. Go ahead, Will.
Yeah. So after reading your book, I'm assuming you probably have a lot of strong thoughts about media organizations. And, if you could put on your, I don't know, librarian hat or teacher hat for a moment, like what message would you have for media organizations about the way that they, show, display, air news, or cover news?
I'm sorry, would you mind repeating that question? It just sort of like cut out for a second.
Yeah. But basically, if you could get all the, top execs of all the major media organizations out there in a room and, wag your finger, have your glasses lowered at the brim of your nose and kind of look at them sternly, like what message would you give them?
It's so hard because I think a lot of times, so speaking of some of those big media outlets, I think the one thing that always makes me kind of chuckle is, and this is not what you're asking, but people often assume that like when I'm talking about things, I'm going to like bash the other whatever news outlet that someone doesn't like. I'm going to say like, oh, they're so bad. But I know that's not what you're asking, but I think it's really, I don't feel super, what's the word? I guess I don't know, maybe I just don't feel super, I know I can see the issues that we're having. And also I just kind of feel like there's a certain, I've gotten to a place of this sort of, this maybe is a passive way of addressing it, but just accepting like this is how it is. These are corporations. And I think for me, it's like recognizing that a lot of them just, there's like money involved, there's revenue, like those are part of why things go the way they go. And I wish it wasn't that way. I wish it could just be like, come on, everybody, get your act together. Just share news. Like, why do we have to make this like so controversial all the time? Like, why can't we just do that? And I wish it could be that way. And also, I think I've gotten to a point where maybe I'm a little bit cynical, but I'm like, well, I guess this is how it is. So how do we move forward? And how do we just say like, this is what it is, and we're going to figure out how to move forward and just live in it. And I guess maybe that's the passive way of addressing it, but I get to a point where I get a little bit, I think, cynical. Just like, well, okay, you guys are all going to be crazy, so we're going to just do what we have to do. And I don't know if that's a great answer or not, but I can feel myself getting to that place sometimes. And maybe it's because I spend a lot of time thinking about information and looking at it, I can get a little bit like, okay, well, anyway, let's just move this way.
Yeah, totally. That makes a lot of sense. I mean, it can be very frustrating sometimes looking at all these major medias and outlets and what they choose and things they leave out and all that. And then everyone's just saying, "Oh, they're so liberal, they're so conservative," and it's like, okay. I mean, I don't know, and it's true. So that's just the world we live in. But it can be very, very, very frustrating. So I had a little bit like I kind of want to walk through a little bit of a thought experiment, if you'll do it with me, okay? And you can be my guide, okay? It'll just take a couple minutes.
Okay.
You can be my guide on. I've come across something, and I need you to guide me on what to do next, okay? Mm-hmm. I come across an article on Facebook, and it's telling me that Joe Biden, it's just been discovered that he and Hunter are presidents in this pedophile ring, and there's incontrovertible evidence now. And click the article and read it, and they found documents on Hunter Biden's computer. They found child pornography or something like that. So now what do I do? Do I believe it's true? What do I do next? I've read this thing. Now what do I do?
I'm sorry.
No, no worries.
You asked me like what to do next.
Yeah, what do I do now? What do I do now? I have I've looked at this, I've read this, I'm hearing these claims.
Yep.
What do I do?
There are a few things I would do. The fact that you're noticing it is good. And then I would probably look at where it came from. What was the news outlet? Who's posting it, or like not even who's posting it, right? Because I think that's where we get confused, is like people think like, I saw this on Facebook. It didn't come from Facebook. And it didn't come necessarily from the person that posted it. Maybe they reshared it. So literally back to that idea of the source, right? Like, open it up. What's the news outlet? If I don't know anything about that news outlet, I Google it. So what can you find out? A Wikipedia page will probably tell you something about a major news outlet. And it might even tell you what some of their biases are. So Googling who's the news, like the news outlet, who posted it. And then also... and then like seeing if you can tell anything. Maybe there's another article that says like that news organization is biased one way or the other, or the Wikipedia page says that. Not a long in-depth research on that news outlet, but just like a quick, like, what can I find out about them? What do I know? How does that affect then what I'm seeing with the content, right? So getting some context before I read the content. And then also what I would do is a quick Google search on whatever the content was. So, Biden XYZ, do another search on that. Is anyone else talking about that from a news outlet that is in a different point of view? And that will help give like a better more full picture of the actual like event that someone is researching. Sometimes I mention there's a website called allsides.com. I mention it in the book. I mention it in my workshops.
Oh, wow. Nice.
If you haven't looked at it, I feel like you guys would really appreciate it. They look at different news outlets and rate them according to like a political point of view, left, right, and center. And I actually encourage people to use that website, not in a like accusatory, weaponizing way, but like they often will show headlines from different news outlets from different perspectives. So they'll show like a right-leaning news outlet and compare the headline of the same story to a left-leaning news outlet and put them side by side. And it's not because I want people to be like, oh, look, they're this way or that way, like that. I don't want that. I want to help people see that like there are different points of view on the same thing. And then that goes back to that idea of that more full picture, that different perspective piece. So that is like with that kind of a scenario, that is also a tool I often recommend, is like see if there are other news outlets. And if you don't know which way this news outlet leans, like you click on it and you're like, I don't know, it came from whatever website and I don't know. A tool like that can also help you figure out like, oh, I realize this is in the far left or right column. Maybe I should see what the opposite side is saying about this. Because sometimes you might not know, right? I don't want to assume that you can always tell a news outlet's bias. And so an organization like All Sides is already doing some of that rating. And so it can be a helpful way, a tool to say like, okay, I see that this is in this column. And I also caution people, like, just because it's in the center, like center politically, doesn't necessarily mean it has more accurate reporting. It just means that's the point of view that they're coming from. So noticing the difference, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be like you only look at things in the center. I'm not necessarily saying that. It's just like, how do you find a variety of viewpoints? And something like you're saying in this scenario can be really helpful to do that.
I was just going to add one thing that so All Sides is great. I use it. Actually, I probably have the chart memorized, but there's another website that I would recommend to people listening to this, and that's Ground News. They actually have a app even that will tell you sort of like if the media you're consuming has more of a right or left leaning aspect to it, so that way you can kind of make corrections just to make sure that you have a more balanced approach at consuming news.
Another great
and
tool.
That's great. And I would I love that the fact that you're looking at all sides and but one thing I appreciate what you said is just because it's center doesn't mean it's correct. And I think that's one of the things that like we have this, I've heard countless people tell me, well, this person, they're more balanced. That's why I trust them. They're more balanced. And of course I get that. I get what's behind that, because if someone has like something that they're really passionate about, they're going to be biased to, convince you, and they might leave out information or whatever. I get all the dangers of that. But it's like, that's why critical thinking is so important, because then you don't have to worry about, are they left? Are they right? Are they center? You don't have to have these shortcuts for things that are really important. I mean, for most things in life, shortcuts, we have to have them. We'll go nuts if we have to try to analyze everything deeply. But for things that are really important, that's why you can go, okay, sure, they're on the left. They're from this, liberal, the what did he call the fake in New York Times? Yeah, they're from the fake New York Times. Okay, great, they're from the fake New York Times, but what did they do? What was their process? What sources did they use? How can we check that? Because then we can actually look and say, hey, I can evaluate them no matter what their perspective is. Mm-hmm. And then I can see if they even agree with basic, assumptions about life. And if we can't even get there first, then it doesn't matter what they're saying. Because we're not going to really agree, because we're not even on the same like planet in terms of like how we're reasoning. So those kind of things are so important. I got one more scenario, and then a last like really easy question, and then we're done. So here's the scenario. This literally happened to me. You're in church. It's after church or whatever. This was years ago, not at my current church. You're in church this years ago, and someone comes up to you. You're sitting in the lounge afterwards, and they say you get into a talk about politics, and it gets into talk about the Clintons, and he goes, "Well, Hillary Clinton's demon possessed, right?" What do you're sitting there? What do you say? What do you do?
Yeah, that is, it's so tricky when we're in a situation like that and it's like, oh, what do I say? I had something recently where it was very similar. Like in the moment, I'm like, oh man. I think there's a rate, again, it depends. But it does depend because I think at the end of the day, when what the studies have really shown about correcting misinformation is that just arguing with someone isn't going to work. And so in the moment, yes, sometimes we need to address it, right? Like, well, I don't know about that. And maybe that's enough for that conversation. It depends on the context, right? But if this is someone
like
that
if he's telling my son, Malachi,
right.
she's demon possessed. You knew that, right? It doesn't matter what your dad says. You knew that, right?
And then that's a hard one, right? Like I do think about that even with like being a parent now, like, oh man, how are we going to navigate this? I think there's a little bit of in the moment that can be done, and there's a long term. So I think it can depend a little bit on like what's our relationship with that person. I think we should definitely speak up against misinformation. I talk about that in the book. Like we don't want to let people just continue to perpetuate conspiracy theories. And we need to be wise about how we address them. So just getting it into an argument or just saying, well, no, that's wrong, might not be effective in countering that conspiracy theory. And this is one area where I think Christians can really have a different response. And this is where people of faith could really be different in how we respond. It doesn't mean in that moment you don't say, well, actually, let me give you can still speak up in the moment. And also we can have a long view of like, if this is someone we have a relationship with and we see regularly, we can be paying attention to, again, the Holy Spirit or any promptings we might have around like, is this actually the time to address it? Or is a separate conversation better? Is an in-person conversation better than posting back to someone online, right? Is talking to your son about it separately the better approach? I think we have a range of options, and I think we live in a world that wants black and white answers. Here's how you address this thing. And I don't know. I just feel like we live in a very gray world. And I think there's addressing it in the moment, yes. And also there's the long view of how do I come back to this later when maybe I can have a more targeted conversation, and it might be more effective if I sit down with someone one-on-one, not in the church coffee hour when there's 20 other people around, but maybe it's like a circling back and saying, hey, can we get coffee this week? I want to talk about this thing that you mentioned. I want to understand why you said that. And then maybe could you listen to my alternative point of view? And so I think there's the short term and the long term, and how do we balance those?
Yeah, I love that. That's brilliant, because this is the kind of stuff that we have to navigate and figure out. Because here's the reality, like, all this stuff, all this fake news, all this stuff happen out there. That's great. And people can, call whatever they want fake news. But when it starts affecting the Thanksgiving meal, and when it starts affecting, which it does, and when it starts affecting the camaraderie amongst believers. And I was even thinking, it's not just believers, anyone, right? So we have a lot of people that watch this show, and I was thinking when you're talking about feeling this like, this kind of prompting or this kind of like nudge from the Holy Spirit, it's like translating that potentially into like a non-Christian setting. You could say something like a gut feeling or a gut reaction, or like you said, you're getting pulled in a direction and you're like, this doesn't feel right, or but you're trying to figure it out and you want to address this misinformation. And I think it's going to require some boldness on people to engage in really uncomfortable conversations and be willing to listen first and talk later. Listen first and talk later. Ask a lot of questions. Because I found that even when you ask questions, people, like, if they really don't know what they're talking about, it only takes a few questions to get there. And it doesn't have to be like it doesn't have to be like mean-spirited questions. I was saying, oh, that's interesting. I never heard of that. What do you mean by that? Like, can you explain how that works? Just let them explain it and see if it makes any sense. And if it does, like, oh man, I'm just not getting it. I must just not be able to get this right now, or whatever it is you got to say. You know, you don't have to, but it doesn't take that much. You know, just to kind of ask questions. But anyway, we have a really wide, audience here, and I would love to give you a chance to even address just from your heart, like kind of what you feel like the most important lesson that you've learned from this research, from writing this book, from bringing this out. What's the biggest lesson you want, like, people of all ilks, Christians, because that's your tribe, my tribe, Will's tribe, so we can address Christians and address non-Christians, what would you want them to hear and take away from your work?
Yeah, I hope that the things in this book, in these workshops, ultimately help people engage, just like we were talking about, more productively in their relationships. So I think if we can understand the personalization that we see online, it might give us grace to understand the personalization someone else sees in their online spaces. I've thought about that a lot, like even within my own family and friends, when I don't always agree with them. If I can find a way to kindly ask them, like, well, where do you get your news from? And then I look at their news sites, and those sites aren't talking about the things I'm passionate about. It helps give me understanding and grace for how to engage with them, because they literally are seeing different information. Literally, so how do we get, like you were saying, how do we get to that base, that same base? And so my hope is that these ideas help people engage kindly with each other and productively and lovingly, regardless of whether they're Christians or not, that we can have a more productive conversation around these issues that are really hard. And there is something about fake news and misinformation and all that, but at the end of the day, how do we care about each other? How do we can disagree, right? It's okay, like, if we don't agree on everything, but like, how can we be working from that same level playing field and then move forward in a way that is productive and kind, and in the end also helps us grow a little bit when we're like we were talking about earlier, like having those conversations with people who might think differently than us. It can help us grow. It can expand our ideas. It can expand the way we see the world. And so those are like the two things, like how it's about growth and it's about people. And that's what I hope people take away from it. And to be mindful, to be intentional, to bring a level of intentionality to our world, again, regardless of what we think or our opinions.
That's so good. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Rachel, for spending some time with us. This has been super awesome. I think your book is it's well deserved. It's a book that needed to be written. Do you go around to like teach this stuff to various churches? Like, is there a place where people can connect with you? Like, how can people access the work that you do?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. It's been really fun to chat. I love talking about these things. Yes, I still do workshops with churches. I took a small break last year when I was like on a maternity leave, but I still am working with churches. I can work with them in person or in Zoom, and they can find that information on my website, which is just racheliwhiteman.com. And then I also post regularly I'm trying to post regularly on Instagram at faithful.factchecking to provide tips and tools and just kind of thoughts around all of these things. So those are two ways people can get in touch.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. And we are definitely looking forward to sort of your next big project, and good luck. Just with the work you're doing. It's really needed in this time. So
yes, absolutely.
And to our listeners and viewers, thank you so much. And we will see you next week. Yeah. Take care.
Bye.